All right, welcome back, everyone. Part 2, looking at Genesis. Like we promised, we're good bartenders. We're not going to promise you a nice beverage and then not deliver. So we're in the cantina again. We're going to talk about the apparent contradictions in Genesis 1 and 2. I'm going to pull up the text. Boom, there it is. Look at that magic of whatever this streaming service is. Technology. I love it. So I'm going to hand it over to Brian, as we typically do. This is kind of Brian's wheelhouse. Again, he's written a book on this. That book is a link to that book is posted. So give it over to Brian. Let's start in Genesis 1.
So part of the issue is that regardless of what your views are, you're going to have to answer certain questions when you read the text closely, finally. And a lot of the answers that are given by people who read them literalistically, they don't actually work. And so I want to actually show you how if you read them literalistically, you really do have a massive problem that I think you're creating and you don't actually need to have. But the first problem, of course, is when you get to the issue of how long it took to make everything, right? So we just got done talking about in the last episode that there's a 7-day structure. So everybody knows, obviously, the world's made in 6 days. God rests on the 7th day, that whole thing. But then when you get into Genesis 2, not a lot of people realize that in Genesis 2, the author actually says that everything's made on a day. And if you look in Genesis 2, 4 here, by the way, the previous creation account, this is why I just want to hit the guy who did the versification, because Genesis 1 Genesis 1 should be through 2:4a.
Yeah.
Like that should be the end of Genesis 1, 2:4a. Instead, it's 2:4a. And then 2:4b would be the beginning of Genesis 2. So if you go to 2:4, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Boom, that should be the end of Genesis 1. Now you have 2:4b. This is the beginning of the second creation account. In the day, or on the day, Yahweh made the earth and the heavens. It's a description from the previous statement when God made heavens and earth. And notice that they're flipped. So the previous one is, these are the generations of the heavens and earth when they were created. And then on the day that Yahweh God made the earth and the heavens. Now, I personally think this is a dependent clause that goes to what follows. It's typically translated to connect to the previous one. Either way, it's a transit. You can say the 2:4a is a transition verse or whatever that is supposed to connect to both chapter 1 and chapter 2. But the point is that the word here is bayom. The word for day is yom in Genesis 1. And the word for day in general is yom. Bayom just means on a day, in a day. It could be on the day, whatever it may be. And typically, traditionally, people have translated this just like when or something like that, because they have seen that if you read it literalistically, it contradicts Genesis 1. Now, what I did in my book is I went through all of the uses of bayom and yom. Yom literally means a day. It does. We're not saying yom means a long period of time. That's a day age argument. I don't make that argument. That's not what it means. What we're trying to argue from Genesis 1 is that it's a theological presentation of days in 7 days. So yeah, yom literally means a day. The issue is, like, is it a theological presentation or is it literally describing what occurred? That's the issue.
Yeah, it's analogical language.
Right. And so Genesis 2:4b is saying that God actually made everything on a day. And I went through in my book to show that it means, like bayom means on a day. It does not mean, just like yom doesn't mean a long period of time, bayom does not mean a long period of time, as it's often claimed to mean by, frankly, everyone, because they're trying to make it cohere with Genesis 1. It doesn't. It literally is saying that everything was made, both the heavens and the earth, all of it, were made on a day. So now we have an issue of, well, which one's literal? Which one's literalistic, in other words? Which one is literally describing how or how much time it took for God to make everything. Is it a day or is it 7 days now? Now we have a contradiction. Now, if you want to fudge on it, you want to go with, well, everybody says it can mean a long period of time, so I'm going to go with that. That's fine. But again, this is where we start to actually intellectually go into a denial, I think, because we're trying to just apologetically make things work that don't work together. Now, that's the least of your issues with Genesis 1 and 2. If you can get around that issue, there's a whole nother issue to come when God starts making things. If you've noticed the previous creation account, God makes the humans last, right? Well, in this account, God has not made anything else before a human that he makes. He makes humans first. So in 2:5, when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for Yahweh had not caused it to rain on. And notice it says land, but the word is eretz, which means earth. So to cause it, so there's no plant or anything on the earth, and the words used there are the words for anything from like grass or herbage or weeds, all the way up to like bigger bushes and plants. So none of these exist on the earth. So
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Are you going to get a pushback? Because I mean, I've also heard Eretz like in reference to land like Israel or different territories.
Right. So Eretz always means earth. And whenever it means like a specific part of the earth, it'll be contextually showing that it's a specific part of the earth. So really what we should be translating it as is the earth of Israel. So it's the earth part that's given to Israel versus the earth of Assyria, which is the earth part given to Assyria. We in English make a separation. And when we're talking about when you're given a part of the earth, we just call it land or your land or the land of this or whatever. But it really is the same word. Now, it could be that this is a localized part of land, but the point is that I don't think it is, because we're not yet talking about the garden. We're not yet talking about anything local until God plants the garden in Eden. So basically, there are 3 reasons I'd probably give as to why this should not be taken as localized eretz. And I think it makes it more probable. Again, exegesis is based on probabilities. And so, first of all, the reasons given for the fact that none of these plants exist in 2:5 is because God had not yet caused it to rain, and there's no human being to cultivate the ground. So this seems to indicate that rain does not exist upon the earth, not just on a particular part of land. Remember, the land is actually going to be described in Genesis 2:10 through 14 as the entire ancient Near East. So there's rain everywhere else, but not here. And furthermore, even if you say, well, okay, well, maybe it's raining elsewhere, but it's not raining here in the entire ancient Near East, the condition for it to exist, this vegetation and the larger plants that we'll talk about in a minute, is that because there's no man to cultivate it, God didn't actually make it yet. So it makes no sense for God to make this vegetation if there's no man to cultivate it. That's kind of the reasoning for it. And I'm going to argue in a minute that there's no animals either to eat it. So why make vegetation? And so the idea is that man needs to be made. Now, have there been multiple people made all over the earth because there's plants now? Like, if man needs to be made first for God to make some plants, then are there people all over the world? I actually think that this creates more problems for the literalistic reading than they realize. And like I said before, the second thing I would say is that eretz, yes, it can be technically, when we say it can be translated this way, I mean, apart from context, just looking at the word, if you were taking a test or something, sure. But usually eretz is collocated with something else. So it's the eretz of Israel. If you're talking about a specific part of the earth, the eretz of Egypt, the eretz of Assyria, the context makes it clear that it's a localized land. Yet everything we've read so far from Genesis 1 Eretz has been the world, the earth. And even up in Genesis 2, we just read that this is the day upon which God made the earth and the heavens, and that's talking about the entire thing. And before that, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. And so there's no precedent here. There's nothing contextual that would make it to well, this is just specifically like this specific part of land. And most people would say, well, it's the part of land that's just Eden. It's just talking about Eden, but Eden hasn't been created yet. God's about to make Eden, but it's not been made yet. And so that's not a good argument either. The third thing I would say is that the universal language of animals and birds that we're about to look at, I think definitively shows that this is talking about the earth and not the land. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. And so it's not just a localized area, and it's all of these plants. And that's what I want. Like if we go to Genesis 1:11, God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, which is not only like one kind, but everything that belongs to the group is the idea. So literally it's all according to its kind. In Genesis 1-11. Now it's really important because the vegetation there is the word asev. And then if you go to 2:5, you have the word asev there. And then it mentions fruit trees in Genesis 1:11. And remember, this is all of them, all of that group that are made. Everything that is classified there, everything that belongs to that grouping. And even though the word fruit trees is not here because God's going to plant them later, the word siach, which is used here for the larger plants and trees and fruit trees, that refers to them. So literally you have in 2:5 that there was not yet any of the larger plants, nor was there any, again, not any of them, any of the lower plants like grass or weeds or herbs or any sort of lower vegetation. So nothing higher, nothing lower. This is a merism, actually. You have the two opposites contrasted in order to convey that nothing of this group has been made. So in other words, like God creating heavens and earth means God created everything in between, not just sky, not just land, but everything in between. Here the same thing. Not anything of the upper plants, bushes, fruit trees, anything like that, shrubs, and nothing of the lower plants, weeds, grass, herbs, all of those things. So meaning no plants at all had been made yet. And why had they not been made? Well, they hadn't been made because there's no rain and there's no man yet. And so you have none of them made here in 2:5, and then God makes the man. So before, and literally it says before any of them were made, terem. So before any of them were made, what happens? Well, verse 7, God forms the man out of the dust of the ground. And then he plants a garden after he makes the man with fruit trees. And then it's got rivers and all of that to water everything that goes out of the garden that he makes after the man. And then he places the man in it. And then he goes to the animals and birds. And so this is the sequence of the narrative. Again, this is I'm gonna make this argument later that the sequence of the narrative is through a vayikol. And so you literally have the dependent clause on the day that God made the earth and the heavens, and then you have the parenthetical, just like in Genesis 1. You've got a parenthetical with the disjunctive vav in verse 5. Now, before God had made any of the plants, the upper plants and the lower plants, and before they were on the earth, before he made any of these plants of the field, which, by the way, of the field means outside the garden, not inside, like we talked about before, because he had not caused it to rain or done any of that. So back to on the day God made the earth and the heavens. And then the dependent clause after the parenthetical would be verse 7. God formed the man from the dust of the ground. And so that's the sequence of the narrative. The parenthetical lets you know the state of chaos. There's no rain, there's no vegetation. Why? Well, there's no man to cultivate vegetation. And so God wouldn't send rain to quench the vegetation, because ultimately there's no reason for it, because there's no man to cultivate it in the first place. So the man needs to be created, then the plants, that's the reasoning, and then God will send some sort of water source to water everything. So ultimately, you've got this vegetation is made on the third day in Genesis 1. But here in chapter 2, it's made, obviously it's made it's not made yet. The man's made, and it's made after the man. So here in Genesis 1 before the man, and here in Genesis 2 after the man. But there's no plants made so far, but I would say that it's of the Eretz in general. Now, again, these two objections are the least of the worst.
Well, and to drive this home, like, this is something it seemed like Augustine was tearing his hair out over. I mean, he
Right.
was like, "Wait, what are you talking about?
Right.
The the bushes."
Yeah, what happened to all the plants? And notice in Genesis 2, there's no rain. The reason why is because the reason why there are no plants, and this is where I think the contradiction probably exists. The reason why there's no, from the smallest weed or grass or anything to the highest plants, is because two things that are given in the text. There's no rain. God has not actually made it rain upon the Eretz, and there's no man to cultivate it. Now, you might be able to get weeds without a man. In fact, I'm pretty sure you can.
Ask Drake. Drake knows.
You can't get them without rain. You can't get them with a water source. And so the fact that God had not yet caused it to rain upon, now, if you say, well, it's just, he didn't cause it to rain on that part of the land, it's like, wait a minute, is are the cloud patterns different? I mean, what do you mean? I guess it's raining everywhere else on the earth, but just not here. Again, there are ways to you can get around, I guess, these two things, but it starts to build a cumulative case to where maybe you're having to make too many excuses for what would otherwise seem like a contradiction. But here's where I think you actually do start to have contradictions.
Apparent contradictions, right?
Well, if you read it literalistically, though,
okay,
it's a bona fide contradiction.
I make the caveat because sometimes I know when I've had conversations with people who have fundamentalist leanings, and if you say contradiction, they're like, "See, you're denying the Bible." It's like,
oh yeah, no, I mean contradiction within their view, not ours. You couldn't have a contradiction within our view unless it was contradicting like theologically or ethically or something.
I'm trying to anticipate.
Yeah, no, good. You're on the ball. 124, and God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures, so living animals, according to their kinds, livestock, that's the behemoth, the domestic animals, and creeping things and animals of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. God made the animals of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. Now, go over to 2:19. Now, out of the ground, the Yahweh God formed all the animals, and I want you to notice this, of the field. By the way, I think I'd have to go back, but I think the plants are also of the field, and this is probably where I was trying to get my argument from before, and I forgot it. But the field is not in the garden. The field are the uncultivated lands outside the garden. So the field is outside the garden. It's the world beyond the garden. It's where the humans are sent in exile, so that Adam has to now cultivate the field, not the garden. And he's going to get thorns and thistles rather than the fruit trees. So that's really important, that these are all the animals outside the garden that are being made. So now out of the ground, the Lord God had formed all the animals of the field. When is he making all the animals out of? Well, after he made the man. When does he make them in Genesis 1? Before he made the man.
Are you an ESV?
Yeah.
So when you look in 19 and it says, now out of the ground the Lord God had formed. Is that literally what it says? Had formed?
Yeah. So no, that's
because
what
that really is a
right.
That phrasing really carries a particular interpretation in it.
It's
because you're trying to say
right.
that what this is saying happened before.
Right. So what people are doing essentially, and you'll have this in the NIV and the ESV, and you'll have it like in Hamilton's commentary on Genesis, even though he doesn't actually give a case for it, he just says it. And I think these scholars think, oh well, the imperfect can be translated as a pluperfect. But if you look at the pluperfect construction in Hebrew, this is not how it's said. This is actually not the case at all. In fact, I want to start out by saying that if you also look at the way these translations translate the verse 19, is that they translate it as a disjunctive. That is, like, it's a parenthetical statement. Like, now, the Lord God had made these animals. But that's actually not what's communicated in the Hebrew. It is not a disjunctive. In fact, it's what's called a vayiktol, or the vav consecutive, which means often in narrative prose, it's the continuation of the story. In other words, it follows what came before. It's not some parenthetical statement that refers back to the past. And so what's actually happening is that if we look here in verse 18, it says, Yahweh God said, it's not good for the man to be, on his own or by himself or whatever. I will make for him a helper that's according to his side. So Yahweh God, so as a result of God saying this, God does this. Just like in Genesis 1, God makes the decree to make something, and then he makes it. And so Yahweh God formed from the ground all the animals of the field and all the birds of the heavens, and he brought them, specifically, he brought them to Adam to see what he would name it, referring to the, each animal or whatever. So the very animals that he made after he made this decree, he brought to Adam. Those are the animals he brought to Adam to name. And they're all the animals, all the birds of the heavens, all the animals of the field. And then Adam, names them, it says. So let's see what the man would name them. Verse 20, and the man gave names to all the behemoth. Now we just saw in Genesis 1, the behemoth, that's the plural form of behemoth, which are domesticated animals. And in Genesis 1, it says that God made the domesticated animals and the ones that are belonging to their class. That's what we translated after their kind, but actually it's a lamed. It's lamed has the idea of like a belonging relationship, and so it's the idea of of possession. So the idea is that he not only made like one type of domesticated animal, he made everything of that class. There's nothing left from that class that he didn't make. He made that animal, and all of that class is the idea. The animal and its class, and everything that belongs to that class. So, or species, or whatever you want to say. So the point here is that he made all of the behemoth, everything that belongs to the class behemoth in Genesis 1, before the man. Now you have the behemoth again here in Genesis 2, and it's being made after the man. And so it's all of them. Now, to go back to the pluperfect idea, that it's, it's following the narrative. So this happens and this happens and this happens. The pluperfect is not expressed by using a vayiktol in narrative this way. In fact, the pluperfect idea is seen throughout Genesis 1 and 2, and this is not the construction for it. So this is not the way Hebrew would convey this idea. So, and I'll give you some examples of this. So in Genesis 1:31, it says, "And God saw everything." There's the vayiktol. That's the main verb. That's the following narrative, like the succession of the narrative. And God saw everything, and then a share with a perfect, not an imperfect, not a vayiktol, not a vav consecutive. It's a perfect that follows a share. The word a share means that or which. So, and God saw everything that he had made. So the pluperfect is formed from the perfect, not the vayiktol, not the imperfect, not the preterite, not the not the vav consecutive. It's formed from the perfect, and it throughout is signified by and a share. It's a relative clause. We have another example in 2:2 through 3. The construction actually appears 3 times, and each one is in the same format. It's the vayiktol is the main clause in the narrative, and it follows the succession of the narrative. Then you have a share, and then it's followed by a perfect. So it says, on the 7th day, God finished, that's the vayiktol, his work, a share that, plus the perfect of asah, he had done, he had created, he had made. Then it says, and he rested, there's the vayiktol, on the 7th day from all his work, that, which is a share again, plus the perfect asah, he had done, he had made. So God blessed, there's the vayiktol, main clause, the 7th day, and made it, there's the vayiktol again, it holy, because on it God rested from all his work, a share that, plus the perfect, he had bara created. So this is not the construction here. If we look here in the verse, what do we have in 19? Vayiktol, and Yahweh God formed from the ground all the animals of the field and all the birds of the heavens, and he brought them to the man. So this is the continuation of the narrative. This follows what he says in verse 18. So God notes that the man exists in verse 18, and it's not good for him to be alone. So the next thing God does is say that he will make a helper for him. It's another imperfect. And so as a result, he forms from the ground. It's not a pluperfect idea. It's not God had the animals that God had formed. If that were the case, what it would have said is actually it would be a vayiktol when it came to God bringing the animals to the man. That's what would have been fronted here. And then you would have had a share yatsar. That is that perfect yatsar, not the vayiktol, the perfect that he had formed from the ground. That's the way it would look. This is not that, and therefore the pluperfect idea doesn't get anybody out of anything. It's not talking about animals that God previously created before the man, and then he's just bringing to the man now. That's not what the verse is conveying in Hebrew. It is, in fact, if you read it literalistically, a contradiction, because the animals are being now made, the very animals, the behemoth that we talked about before, are being made after the man here, even though in Genesis 1, they're made before him. Now, that brings us also to the other group of animals that are made. And in both texts, it says that God actually makes all the birds. So if we look in chapter 1, verse 20, and God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth. So, above the earth, what's that? That's the heavens. Across the expanse of the heavens. So that's kind of, even though it's not birds of the heavens like in Genesis 2, you get that it's referring to all the birds of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds. By the way, according to their kinds there means that belonging to that class, belonging to that group again. And every winged bird belonging to that group. So all the group, everything that belongs to the group of winged bird, that was made in Genesis 1. Every single one. That's what the text says. Now, go over to Genesis 2. Now, this is obviously this is before man, because this is on the 5th day, not the 6th, that he's making all the winged birds. So 2:19, which is after the man has been made, now you have all the birds of the heavens. So Yahweh God formed, and remember, you cannot translate the pluperfect anymore. So it's all Yahweh God formed from the ground all the animals of the field and all the birds of the heavens. Not all the birds of the garden, not all the birds of the specific area of land, not all the birds of the field. In fact, this one can't be played with like the other ones can, because all the birds of the heavens clearly means all the birds of the heavens. It's all the birds of the sky. They're not just flying above the garden or something. It's all of them that it's all of them that belong, that fly in the sky. All of those were made here. Just like in Genesis 1, all of them were made there. Not just one kind of bird, but everything that belongs to the class of a winged bird, which is all birds. And literally that's what it says. Every winged bird belonging to the class of winged birds. So you understand that it's not just easy to pass over these contradictions when you read it literalistically. Now, we obviously don't think the text is contradicting itself at all, because we don't read it this way. We actually think that it's the real events of the historical event of God creating the world, and it is being described as most ancients would describe it, in symbolic fashion to convey theological and ethical ideas as to why God made the heavens and earth, why God made man, what he's for, what relationship does man have to God, what's the purpose, what is creation in relationship to God. It's about relationship. It's about the ethics. It's about who man is as God's image and what he's to do, and what the animals are in terms of their relationship to man, and what man's to do with them, and what man's to do with the plants, and cultivates and is fruitful and multiplies, and all of that in order to convey God's sovereignty over chaos and undoing chaos in the world. It has a lot to do with this theology. And it feeds into, frankly, a theology of Genesis that has to do with, good and evil, and why evil still exists in the world. And God's, the answer is God's still creating. But it's not trying to tell us a literal description of how God made everything.
This is the problem with interpretation, is now when you
Right.
read this, so a fundamentalist will read this and say, had formed, not formed.
Yeah.
Right. As if they know, they don't have any understanding of Hebrew. They're just guessing that based off of what they've read in English.
Well, you literally could just go through and make it all nonsensical and say had formed for all of it. It's like, what is the flow of this narrative that causes you to translate it had formed? And now are you creating another contradiction because now you have animals with no plants to eat? Like, again, it's just, why do this? You're just creating this big ball of contradiction then, and more problems. There's no need to do all this. Instead, it's very logical in the narrative. The narrative flow and how you get time in a narrative is when one thing is mentioned after the other. So he creates the man. God, that he plants a garden. So there you have the vegetation. He creates the man, plants the garden. So he makes the vegetation. Then he puts the man in the garden. But the man's alone. He needs a companion. So then he creates the animals to see if they can be companions to the man. They can't be. So what does he do? Well, he creates the woman then to show that the woman's the companion. That makes sense in the flow of the narrative. So all the animals of the field are then made after the man. And then it says all the birds of the air. So together with all the birds of the air, and they're made after the man in the text. That means Genesis 2 is not the sixth day. What it means is that Genesis 2 is a presentation of the act of creation that's different than the presentation in Genesis 1. The presentation in Genesis 1, if you look at it, is cosmological. It's from God's perspective. That's why it's heavens and earth. And then you look over to Genesis 2 and it's earth and heavens, right? Now we're looking from the ground up, from the perspective of man. So he needs to be created first because it's through his perspective that he's now seeing the world made. Genesis 1, that's not the case. Genesis 1, you've got the cosmic view. Man doesn't have to be there because God's there. It's God creating the cosmic water, splitting them. God creating the luminaries, all of that. You don't have any of that in Genesis 2.
Yeah, and in literature, you call this a POV shift. You only have one character in Genesis 1. That's God.
Yeah.
And then you get a shift of POV.
Right. And so now that you have that point of view of the human, you're going to get that now. So through the perspective of man, everything's localized. You don't have the cosmic view. And so, well, what's in his local sphere? Well, in his local sphere are animals and birds and plants and those things. And so he's witnessing the creation of those. So as he witnesses the creation of those, he's now going to witness, of course, the creation of the woman as well. And they're split, and these things are created in between them rather than before them, as in Genesis 1. So Genesis 2 has Yahweh. It's more personal because it's in relationship to man, whereas you have just Elohim in Genesis 1 because it's in relation to the universe, not necessarily the name of God in there, because it's not in relationship to man. Now, again, like we said before, if you really want to try to make these things fit, you can get around them by not following the flow of the narrative, playing with the grammar, playing with where you think things are being made and all that sort of thing, playing with the language. But if you follow the flow of narrative, you're going to have to admit, this is why Augustine had a problem with it. This is why liberals had a problem with it. This is why fundamentalists still have a problem with it. This is why people become apostates, because they'll see and they'll be like, the explanation doesn't really quite work. When you read the flow, it does seem like these are two different creation accounts. And when you read them that way, you're going to either say, well, then I guess it's just human made and it's a compilation and maybe God didn't really write the Bible. Or you're going to say, maybe I'm reading it wrong. And there's a reason why. Why is it different? This is why you should, in the Gospels, ask the question, why is the fig tree in a different place? Why is the cleansing of the temple in a different place? Could it be conveying something theological of why Matthew puts it here and Mark puts it here? I mentioned the fact that, like, in Matthew, when talking about divorce and remarriage, it's in the context of him just talking about you're going to hell if you loosen one of these laws. And if you do these things, you're going to, right before it is the murder law. You're going to pay every penny, that sort of thing, in order to convey that, look, this is a serious thing. It's adultery and it is deserving of hell and it will get the death penalty of hell. But in Luke, it's not put in the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke's version, it's not even the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain. So it's a mountain in Matthew's gospel because he wants to convey the idea of Jesus is the new Moses. So Matthew has changed the detail of the actual historical event, or Luke has changed it. I think Matthew's changed it to convey that theological idea. In Luke, it's just in a plain. He's just in a level area. But that whole command about divorce and remarriage is not in there. Luke actually takes it from there, and he sandwiches it in between a parable that is about, actually sandwiches in between a comment about the law and the prophets not being dismissed or whatever, and then I wouldn't even say it's a parable, a story of a man who goes to hell for not listening to scripture and obeying it. He doesn't say anything about hell, but he just has, it seems like it's completely out of place. It makes no sense. Like you're talking about the law and the prophets, then all of a sudden this command about divorce and remarriage, and then the story about the rich man and Lazarus. And you're just like, what in the world? Is Luke just throwing things in his gospel? When you ask questions, why is this different than this other account? You need to find out, okay, then either these people are incompetent and they're making errors, like liberals would say, or they purposely did that for a reason. And now you need to find what's the reason for it. And that's going to build your theology and your ethics and your understanding of how to read scripture much better. Same thing here. Why are these two accounts different? Regardless of whether you try to make them fit or not, they look very different. Either way, everybody has to admit that. It's not the same thing. Genesis 2 did not run down the 7 days and then get to humans and then talk about the humans. So obviously it's talking about the accounts very differently. And this is an account on the day God made the earth and the heavens, on the one day that he made them.
Yeah, we have a really low view, I think, of storytelling, and that's part of what contributes to this.
Yeah.
We have this distinction, and maybe this is a larger conversation for later, but we have this distinction in our culture, nonfiction, fiction, and we think there's a hard line between these things.
Right.
And so we think fiction means it's not true. There's nothing true in this. And nonfiction is there's nothing fantastical in this. And that distinction has caused the problems with these readings, because ultimately there is truth in using literary elements in a particular way to mold the story to present theological truth. Truth doesn't need to be hardline fact. This is what we've seen post-Enlightenment with a fact value split, that if you can't sense it with your five senses, you can't, lay hold of it, that somehow there's no truth to it, there's no value, there's no meaning. These things have to be separated.
Yeah.
And we do the same thing with the text.
Well, and I think especially here, so I would actually argue, as I alluded to in the last episode, that this is a different genre of literature as well. Primeval history is a history that frankly is not known. It's before written history. And because of that, the ancients aren't trying to describe anything literalistically, because they don't know what occurred literalistically. So instead, what they do is they take elements. They know that a flood occurred, so they take elements from the flood, and they usually incorporate those because creation, we know creation took place again after the flood. So they kind of almost start at the flood, and they describe creation in terms of flood or some sort of chaotic element. Here it's desert. But they describe things more symbolically, or at least not in terms of trying to describe them as they occurred, but using ancient Near Eastern symbols, ideas. So in Genesis 1, you have the primordial waters that represent chaos. Here you've got the desert that represents chaos. And in that, you see a correspondence. And I've said before, look, you've got the same God. You've got the same God in Genesis 1 and 2. So those are parallel. You've got an issue of chaos. And what's the chaos? Well, the chaos is there's no place for humans. There's no inhabitable place. And the chaos is that there's no humans in both texts. And then what goes on is you have people and place made. In the first one, you have place made and then people. In the second one, you've got people and then place. But you've still got people and place going on. So those are parallel. Same animals, same birds, same plants. And this is where we've talked about before, but there's a problem with understanding what the commands are, because if you read these as different accounts talking about different things, now you've got two commands given by God. One, be fruitful and multiply, which seems really serious about the creation and perpetuation of humankind, of covenant children, all that. And it's like, man, I understand that command. That sounds great. And then you got a command, don't eat this fruit. And you're like, wait, so this one was really weighty, but now I just have to eat a certain amount of fruit and kinds. And that seems kind of weird. And in Genesis 1, it seemed like all the fruit trees belong to me. Why now do I, Genesis 2, God's adding something and saying, well, all the fruit trees are given to you in Genesis 1, but now you can't eat one. Or if we understand that everything's parallel, same humans made, then we start to understand maybe the command here is the same as the command here.
It's presented differently.
Presented symbolically.
Yeah.
And people are like, well, I don't like that because it's symbolism. It's like, okay, well, how do you interpret the serpent in Genesis 3?
A lot of people like it's a literal talking serpent.
Right. If you're a liberal, I don't know any conservatives that believe that it's a literal talking serpent. They have to put something on it. They have to say, well, it's the devil
in a serpent disguise, because that's how they work around it.
Right.
It's like it can't be that the devil is presented that way, but isn't actually that way.
But I want you to notice, let's say you're going to interpret it that way, that it's a possessed snake. That's not what the text says. You're saying that the word serpent symbolically means possessed serpent, possessed by the devil.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what even John, in interpreting Genesis 3 and interpreting he doesn't say that the devil possessed a serpent. He said he was the serpent.
But
he is the serpent of old.
This is the problem with Genesis in particular, is people have read it so many times that they skim through it and they go, yeah, I know exactly what that means. Yeah. And there is no actual thinking about it more deeply, trying to understand, okay, well, that seems confusing. That's not lining up with this, because it's just a skim read.
Right. Well, and they think that it reminds me of Hal Lindsey and his, and I don't remember if it was Hal Lindsey or someone else interpreted it this way, but I thought Hal Lindsey interpreted the locusts in Revelation as helicopters. Somebody did that. I remember someone doing that.
I've heard helicopter stuff in Ezekiel.
Right, like Apache helicopters or something.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. So that's obviously, he would actually say, well, I'm interpreting the text literally as it sounds. Mm-hmm. And we would say, but that's a symbolic interpretation. I would say the same thing with the serpent. If the serpent is anything but a literal serpent that's talking, then it's a symbol for something else. It represents something else. Either the devil possessing a snake, which is not the way the Bible interprets it later, or the devil literally is a serpent, which is really weird because we're also told by the Bible that the serpent, or the devil, is an angel of light, not literally a serpent of the field. Notice it's serpent of the field.
He comes as an angel of light.
Right. So maybe it's a snake that transforms. I mean, it's kind of an odd thing.
He's a shapeshifter.
Again, if you play,
he turns into a dragon later. Remember?
Yeah, I know.
So the point ultimately being that everyone's actually taking this symbolically. Everybody, except for liberals who believe it's literally a mythology of a talking snake. But as soon as you say this is the devil, even Calvin is like, this is literally a talking snake. But then he's like, but then we really know it's the devil speaking through this. It's like, okay, well, wait a minute then. It's actually the devil then. So you're taking it symbolically, and he's trying to take it as literal as possible as well. So everyone really takes it. Everyone, I think, that's Orthodox, because you're going to have to then, now you're going to have a problem with John, who says it literally is the devil. Mm-hmm. And not only was, but it is. So that Satan is the serpent. Like in the day that John's talking, even Satan's the old serpent of old.
He's still slithering around.
Yeah, I guess so. He's still in the field. Whenever you pick up a snake, just be careful. That could be the devil. So everyone's
Paul got bit by him.
Yeah, exactly. And it didn't do anything. See, there's a theological thing.
There you
go. But everyone's taking it symbolically. All I'm trying to point out is that a lot of symbolism, a lot of mythological symbolism is used in the description of what everyone realizes are real events. The events are not made up. They're not fictional events in terms of they're just, created for this purpose. These events are actually occurring, but they're being described with a lot of mythological terminology and things that the ancients believe. So we don't believe that the atmosphere is literally a roof that's keeping out water. Now, you have creationists who are like, oh, but it is. It was a solid dome that God created, and he kept waters back, and then in the flood, he let them all loose. But if you notice,
I have heard this.
If you notice, though, God doesn't get rid of the canopy. He just opens doors in it for the flood. So, but with the creationist view of that is that God actually gets rid of the canopy. It's like, no, it can't be the solid canopy has gotten rid of. It has to be there, which is why you have modern flat earthers believe there's an actual literal solid canopy that's there in some way. It's, whether it's of layers or it's solid or whatever it may be. But you don't need to do any of this. There's not cosmic waters outside the earth. That's a way of them describing creation because they don't know how to describe it in any other way. It's not literal. It's symbolic. It represents something else. And so it's important to understand that there's a lot of the man is not literally an image. He is not an idol. This is also problematic because people, well, how is man literally the image of God? Well, he has to be like God in some way. And it's like, no, the one telling you to be like God is the devil in Genesis 3. The image has nothing to do with you being like God. That's a misunderstanding. You don't look like God some way. Image is referring to an idol in a temple. You're not that, literally. But you are that symbolically, figuratively. And so once we start to understand that primeval history is a particular genre that's closer to Revelation, ironically, in the way it describes things, than it is to something like even Genesis 12 through 50.
Yeah, Revelation, another book that is misinterpreted in hyper-literalistic ways.
Well, I mean, this argument's not going to go anywhere for people who try to read Revelation literally, right? So if you try to read that, like, I can't help you in Genesis, because most people who would not read it, Revelation literally, they're still on this kick of reading Genesis literally, even though it's very much that type of genre. Now, the reason why they do that is because people are not familiar with primeval history as a genre. That's all it is. And what you do when you're not familiar with a genre is you try to find a genre you are familiar with already and put the text in that and read it that way through that lens. And when you do that, you have to ask, are the ancients in which this text is created reading the text through that lens of that genre? And if they're not, then you're reading it wrong and you're changing the text and you have a different Bible from that point on. And I would argue once you start reading creation accounts, you'll realize they're not doing that. This is a specific genre. They're reading it in a very symbolic way. And that's why they can say things like, when did creation start? Well, in years of yore, in days of yore, in days and nights, on the day when creation was made, when the day when heaven and earth were still combined. It's that sort of thing rather than a literal, well, I need to figure out how many days it took the gods to make everything. Because I need to fight evolutionists, which is not even what they're fighting against in the ancient world. They're answering questions, again, as to why were these things made? Why was I made? And what am I supposed to do in relationship to them?
And ultimately, the biggest takeaway from all of this, comparing 1 and 2, looking at apparent contradictions, if we're going to take a literalistic view of both of those chapters. And instead of doing that, not even really, almost in one way saying, I don't really care what's happening. Like, God created this, that's great. But why is he telling me this? So if I go from just trying to argue indefensible positions of contradictions to why is he telling me this? And now I have a God in chapter 1 who from the beginning and the end is in charge, is a sovereign over everything. So I live in a world that I know at the very end, this God is going to say it is good, right? And I can place myself in the vein of that creator God and know that if I'm with him, if he's my God, if he actually is pleased with me, then my good is at the very end of this, regardless of my circumstance now.
Yeah, and it places the command in that context, and therefore now I can't make the argument, when God says to be fruitful and multiply, that there are situations where I can't, because then chaos will ensue and I can't control anything. If God's sovereign over everything, I now can obey the command that he gives.
Yeah, or any other ethic, right? So now, like, which one has the gospel in it? The literalistic view of, yeah, we got to keep the order. It's 6 literal days because transgenderism, man. And if you let it go, everyone's going to turn into a girl as a guy. I mean,
they're all going to become homosexual if you, don't believe in 7 days.
Right. Even though all the worshippers of Molech who actually were transvestites or not transvestite, but transgender, who like cut their genitals off, became priests in Molech, probably had literal creation views. Some of them probably did. Like, which one has the gospel in it?
Yeah.
I mean, the one that says God, the one that created from the beginning, which John says is the Word, is the same one who at the very end is going to say, this is good. I mean, come on. I don't know what you're going to bring to an atheist other than that. And say, like, and then they can go into all the other stuff they want to. But at the end of the day, there's other arguments to bear against that. But Genesis is as gospel giving as Revelation 22.
Well, yeah, and again, this is perfectly in line with how they would have understood it. Like, literally, so the most popular creation account in Babylon is Enuma Elish, right? So that's Marduk is being seated on high. He's the one who has victory over Tiamat, which, by the way, the word Tehom is the primordial waters in Genesis 1. Tiamat is primordial waters in Enuma Elish. And this is from which he's going to separate the waters in order to create. And he's going to create a rakia. He's going to create like a ceiling. And the sun and the moon and stars are going to go along that and all that. And this is the creation account. It's connected to the king and all that. Now, if they thought that was literal, then the problem is that there are other creation accounts in Babylon that are well known, and those guys would have been killed and those accounts would have been blotted out if they thought that was somehow attacking their literal understanding of creation. Because in another creation account, it's just Marduk. He's not fighting any sort of primordial water. He just builds this raft and puts some sand on it, and he makes the world that way. And there's no fight or anything like it. And that's fine. No one was like, oh, but that contradicts our literal understanding, because they're both symbolic. No one believes that this God is taking a raft and the world is a raft with some dirt piled on it. Like, that makes no sense.
It's almost like the fundamentalist views the Bible like how Muslims view the Quran. Yes. Where it's like it just fell down from heaven in this perfected state. There was no human interaction. There was no human author. It was not influenced by its culture. It wasn't responding to anything. It's a very Muslim way of viewing scripture.
Well, even like the Hebrew language is a development of Semitic language that doesn't come about until, the earliest, maybe the 13th century. And that's really early. Most scholars would say about like the 10th century or 11th century or something. But that means it's a development. It's not a language from heaven. Now, if that hurts your faith, you've got a problem. Like, if that in any way scratches your faith, that the language, that in other words, that Adam was not named Adam, he probably had something more closer to like a Sumerian name. Noah's name is probably not even Atrahasis. It probably is Utnapishtim, which is the earliest name we have for the Noah figure in the flood accounts. And maybe not even that, maybe like an earlier thing than that. So that all the genealogies, none of that is their actual name. Those are Hebrew interpretations of their names. And they're probably not even their names. It's probably just the author naming them those things for theological purposes. Mm-hmm. Again, if that hurts your faith, you're not reading the Bible correctly.
Yeah, it's a small God that can't work through his creation and has to drop in a text from heaven, because apparently he's not powerful enough to actually decree all things.
Well, how's the New Testament written? Nobody believes that's dropped from heaven. It's literally John is countering Gnostics. He's interacting with Gnostics. Paul is countering Judaizers. He's interacting with Judaizers.
I mean, Paul literally interacts with poetry.
Right.
Yeah.
With popular poetry. Yes, pagan poetry of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, there are all sorts of language is not just Hebrew and Greek so that I can learn Hebrew and Greek and now I can read the Bible and understand what it says. If you learn Hebrew and Greek, but you import your cultural ideas rather than saturate Hebrew and Greek with their own cultural contexts, then you haven't learned the language at all. You're just glossing English ideas onto Greek and Hebrew words.
You're just a bilingual eisegete.
Well, yeah. Again, I'm putting I'm Americanizing whatever's said in a Chinese culture, right? I'm going to England and I'm like, hey, I'd like your fish and chips, and then they hand me fries and I'm throwing it in their face. How dare you? I said chips. Don't you plainly understand me? Can't you understand English? And it's like, well, yeah, things mean different things depending on the culture, and you have to figure out what does it mean to that culture. Until you understand that in England, chips means fries, you're not going to understand what you're ordering. And the same thing with the Bible. Until you understand that this is a specific genre of literature and it's to be read a particular way, it doesn't. You can talk all you want about how Yom means a day. It's like, yeah, we all agree Yom means day. That has nothing to do with the issue. How are you reading this text? Are you reading it the way that the ancients would have read it? And we know that because the ancients have no problem. You mentioned Jubilees earlier. The ancients have no problem changing it.
Yeah, yeah.
But we don't even have cultures today that have the same beliefs about what a day is. I mean, you can start a day at midnight. You can start a day at sunrise. You can start a day at, sunset.
Notice here that the days are evening and morning. So they start in the evening, which is why the Jewish day starts 6 o'clock in the evening, and then it ends the next 6 o'clock in the evening. And then we have, the Roman day, of course, is more of what we follow, I think. But yeah, it's just it's fascinating to look at this and think that people are just, again, goes back to what we talked about before. Well, I'm just giving the plain reading. I'm reading it, how it sounds like to me. Again, and that's always the question, right? To whom? Plain reading to whom?
Yeah, I don't like plain yogurt. I like flavored yogurt.
Well, again, why does the author of Jubilees feel like he can change the narrative?
Yeah, he changes it from the 7th to the 6th day, right?
Yeah, why does the psalmist feel like he can change the narrative? Because by the way, does everybody know there's another creation account?
There's another creation account, yep.
Like, why? Why does the author of Proverbs feel like he can mess with it? Why does Jeremiah feel like he can kind of mess with it? Because it's not literal, and that's not where faithfulness is found. It's in the message that it's conveying. That's where the faithful will anchor their lives, not in the description.
Yeah, that's good.
All right.
Do we have any other contradictions?
Let's end there so that I can make dinner for my family.
Let's end there.
Literally or figuratively? Like, are you?
Well, I was maybe going to do it literally, but maybe I could just do it figuratively.
There you go.
How many hours?
Yeah. It's going to take me 6 days. 6 literal days.
And maybe just as that example, we could also say that not just because things have a figure or theological meaning, it doesn't mean that everything is figurative.
Right.
You understand that contextually, according to the context, according to the genre you're reading. We understand that there's a higher amount of symbolism in poetry. There's less symbolism in historical narrative, but it's filled with theological significance and arrangement nonetheless. It's still a theological presentation.
But we take this for granted because we actually do this all the time in our culture. We use idioms, we use analogical language all the time.
Yeah.
Figurative language to convey literal meaning. It's like the Amelia Bedelia example I brought up last week, that last time, you know what I mean?
Way back when we did that.
Back when we did it an hour ago.
Barely remember
that if I say to you it's raining cats and dogs, I'm communicating to you in a figurative way something that is literally happening. And you know what I'm saying. You know that it's figurative language to convey something. Hey, go look outside. It's pouring rain. And we do this all the time. We do this even in historical narrative in our time. We use idioms. It's just that we're so familiar with them in our culture that we're like, yeah, I know what that means. But it's still figurative language.
We do
Allow
it in
the same
too.
for ancient people.
Yeah, like what's Washington crossing the Delaware? Like he's like one knee up and it's like he didn't do that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I remember my elementary school teacher saying that is not, in no way would you be doing that in a boat filled with men
in the
going
winter
across an icy river.
Yeah.
That would be, everyone would probably have killed him for doing that. It'd be a immediate revolt. But it's depicted that way for an ideological reason, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason why when you read or you look at the descriptions, the reliefs of the pharaohs, and the pharaoh is out front and in front of the army, and he's larger than everybody else. Like, wow, is Pharaoh a giant? You get these people who literally you read, and they look back at these depictions, these reliefs, whether in Assyria or Egypt, and they're like, look, giants existed. And it's like, oh, come on.
You
guys.
see this in art all the time. In Christian art, you constantly see a halo around. Right. I mean, obviously, they're using images of Jesus, but you have this even around saints like John the Baptist, right? You get a halo. It's meant to convey theology to you. Art is telling you something true. It's just doing it in an artistic way.
So let me actually go to a place that proves, unless you're a flat earther, everything that we have just said, in case you're like, no, I'm still going to just go with the literal view. Okay, that's fine. But here's where I think you're inconsistent. If you go over to Joshua and God talks about Joshua actually asked God to make the sun stand still. And the text says that God did that he made the sun stand still, and never has there been a day like that when God listened to man or whatever. And you might say, well, see, God can do anything. Yeah, that's fine. How is the sun standing still when the sun is not that which is moving around the earth? It's obviously talking about extending the day. So it's not just talking about, cosmically the sun's moving. Yeah, we all realize the sun's still moving as well. But the issue is we're talking about in a day, the day was extended in some way. Is that literal or is it figurative? And why? And I would say, I actually think a lot of people have a problem because they don't know the ancient Near Eastern context. So they're trying to work it out, and all they can say is, well, it's literal. And it's like, okay, so are you denying that the earth goes around the sun rather than the other? Like, I mean, what do you mean? And they're stuck in this conundrum of like, well, okay, I don't, or they'll just be like, I don't know.
But all they have to do, this is what has led to flat earthers.
It has, because ultimately it's like, no, I have to be faithful to the Bible and read it literalistically rather than understand. There are a couple different explanations that sound much better and make more sense and have more of a connection to the ancient Near Eastern world in which this is written and to the reader in the ancient Near Eastern world. And I'm two explanations that are different that make more sense than God literally stopping the sun, which is not moving across the earth in the first place.
Right. And putting the miracle on the proper emphasis.
Right. And you might say, well, it's just phenomenological. He's stopping the earth. And it's like, you realize what would happen if God stopped the earth? Again, can God do anything? Sure.
But that's not even what it says. It doesn't say that the earth was stopped. It says that the sun was.
Right. So you're still interpreting it symbolically.
You're denying a literal interpretation.
Thing represents this thing. Right. It's still symbolic. Now, of course, the ancient Eastern explanations I think are better is one has to do with the fact that sun god and moon god are the war gods, and in a Canaanite theology, and it's talking more about the fact that the gods of the Canaanites are not going to help them. The other one is an explanation of when the sun and moon are in the sky at the same time. In the ancient Near Eastern world, it's an omen that is for or against you in times of war. And so it's a matter of, it's actually giving the Israelites the upper hand, that basically saying that God has declared the Canaanites' destruction or whatever. That makes more sense in it's war context.
Yep.
It makes much more sense in that context if you understand that. But if you're reading it literalistically, now you have to actually deny heliocentrism and go with geocentrism, and probably end up with a flat earth as well when you read texts that like the earth is standing on, pillars and whatnot. It's like, well, yeah, if you're mythologically describing the world in a bunch of water as like a sphere of land in water, and it's going to have pillars. I don't know what the pillars are standing on, but ultimately it's got to be on these pillars. But then you can just ask, oh, maybe these are just mythical descriptions and they're being symbolically used to talk about the makeup of the earth, and it's not a literal description. And then you can start reading the Bible better.
Yeah, I think it's good. Well, if you liked what you heard, hit that subscribe button. If you didn't like it, still hit it and keep listening to us, so your mind changes slowly over time.
Write rude comments or whatever you like.
Or leave your comments and your critiques below.
Right. Yeah. Tell us how you've been on top of a mountain you can see for miles and
and you saw no curvature.
And you saw no curvature. That's
Did
fine.
you see that? That's the newest. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just watched. I wasted time watching part of a debate.
No,
and then I turned it off because I was like,
You're
this is so stupid.
No.
But it is that sort of thing. It's like, well, I mean, how can you see that mountain over there? It's like, because you went on top of a mountain. What do you mean? Literally. That makes sense in a curved earth. It actually makes less sense on a flat earth, because now you've increased the distance by going on top of a mountain.
Correct. So if you want to we'll have to engage you if you want to talk about this more. But also, if you want to support us, you can be a patron, which means that you have free access to the cantina. You come in even when it's closed and watch us.
You have to pay for your free access.
You gotta pay. Yeah.
There's a bouncer at the door.
You have
and there's
unlimited access to Drake's home and his finances.
Yes, digitally through the Patreon account.
Symbolically speaking.
Yeah.
You can see my house through the camera.
There's a cover for this cantina.
There's a cover, and you have to pay it every month. So I think that's how it works. Right? Anyway, if you want to support us, if you like this ministry, become a patron and subscribe and like, and we'll talk to you next time. Peace.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Haven't read the series, might not understand what would need to happen.
Have you read all of them?
I've read all of Frank Herbert's novels. Yes.
Oh, you've read all of them. I've only read the first one because my grandma told me that the other ones were bad.
Let me just start with this. Frank Herbert is not a good storyteller. Not a good storyteller. He's a fantastic world builder.
Harry and I, we're pals. Harry and I were
Harry and the Hendersons.
You grew up at Hogwarts?
The first book came out. Harry and I were around the same age, and so I grew up with books. Like the last book came out when I was 19, and Harry was around 19. This, I went to a Christian high school, so this was a big deal. It was a big thing. Harry Potter is evil, and you can't be reading this or participating in this.
The reason why I like Moby Dick so much is, to me, there's a parallel with Genesis. So it's actually history. It's history that Melville he's interviewed. This actually occurred to a bunch of whalers.
Yeah.
And the survivors he interviewed.
Yeah.
And it became this book. But notice how he's writing this history. It's not, here's all the facts that happen. All right, the end. He's writing it because he wants to put meaning and a message to what has occurred.